introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lewis Campbell from Flinders University, speaking on the long road to the deep north, empowering Human Research Ethics Committee review in the Northern Territory.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. So good afternoon. I'm Lewis Campbell. My affiliation is down as Flinders University. I've got affiliations with Menzies School of Health Research and with the Northern Territory Department of Health and Royal Darwin Hospital as well. So I'm going to talk today, if I can get this working. I'm going to talk about how we, as a Human Research Ethics Committee, put on a little bit of a working bee and ended up joining the NMA as a National Mutual Acceptance Committee. This could get a little bit technocratic. I'm going to start off with this slide, repeating from Michelle, Jackie and Mary's excellent talk earlier today. Just to remind you, this is our process broadly, and the arrow from something coming in for our acceptance, our mutual acceptance of another Primary Ethics Committee's review. The heart of the questions asked, it's not the only one, but is it likely that risks imposed by the research have not had an opportunity to be considered? I'm very grateful to be a guest here on beautiful, rainy, lush Larrakia country, which it always was and always will be because it was never ceded. And I pay my respects and gratitude to the elders of the past, of the present, and those yet to come. And I share in the benefits brought to us all by the stewardship of country by all the First Nations of Australia. And I acknowledge all those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening. I'm going to talk about the inside of this journey towards the NT Ethics Committee being part of the NMA, and I'm going to talk about why we did it and what it felt like from the inside. At times it felt long and arduous and even sort of risky, but it was worth it, if even just for the process of journeying. So there we go. I should have called it I initially called it the long road to the deep north, but Oku no Hosamichi means the narrow road to the deep north. And this is Tsuki wa hyakutai no kakyaku nishite yukika o toshimo mada tabipito nare. The days and months are travelers of eternity, like the years that come and go. It did feel like it was eternal at some points. It's now 10 years since I joined the Human Research Ethics Committee of the Northern Territory Department of Health, which is its proper name. And it's administered by Menzies School of Health Research. Menzies was established in 1985, and it's incorporated by an act of the Northern Territory Parliament in that year as well. Part of the act defines the functions of the school as, first of all, to promote improvement in the health of all people in tropical and central Australia. The Ethics Committee has strong Indigenous leadership, as you've heard. Really, the Aboriginal Ethics Committee form our moral centre, and they meet separately and guide discussion of the broader group and have a veto over decisions on progress of research through the committee. So that's 1985 and my 10 years here. In 1687, Basho took a journey beyond the Shirakawa barrier into the wild land of the interior, where there were stumps of battles and mystery all around. So I'm going to leave the technocratic bits behind. The NT is a small place. That's good for rapid career progress, but you can imagine and see people becoming paralyzed by fear of the unknown or fear of failure or fear of yourself. As a counter to that, the concentration of expertise is quite high, and the concentration of expertise in getting over that fear and the need to work slightly outside of your usual field means that collaboration can be very easy and very fast. Menzies is particularly good at it. And Menzies is particularly good, I think, at forming relationships across boundaries of health services and academic institutes. The Northern Territory in general is very culturally diverse. That's why most people come here, or why we stay. When we say culturally diverse, but I genuinely think that diversity is coupled with tolerance most of the time. And I get the feeling that all the cultures that are here contribute to the public sphere. And people might laugh a little bit when I say that it's cosmopolitan. I think that is really the definition of cosmopolitan. All of that meant that I found a very committed and forward-looking ethics committee with exciting projects to review and not a few problematic applications, which you can look on the bright side and say that you can make that an opportunity to be of genuine use. At the same time, the Territory is an easy place for incomers like me to get carried away with tribalism. Are you a top-ender or a centralian? Are you a believer or an apostate? Are you with me or against me? In some ways, we've accommodated those identities, and in some ways, we've moved on. It's all well to be a big fish in a small pond. What matters, we're moving nationally. The NHMRC's status and the national statement are pretty unusual in the world. It's pretty unusual for ethics committees to have that sort of authoritative document and all of the ethics committees to be looking at the same one. That is a national advantage. And that advantage was used through the leadership of Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland to harmonise ethical review. At the time when the harmonised review, or HOMER, was proposed, I just started sitting on the ethics committee and I couldn't quite see the point of it. It did seem a lot of work for little benefit. But we had stellar expertise to call on. We were sitting as a committee sort of severed from the sponsoring institutions. The Department of Health provides the funding, it's administered by Menzies, and we answer really to a whole lot of other stakeholders, including the universities and the Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations, the ACHOs. We had no fee structure, we had no real incentive to review outside applications, and it felt like we were busy enough with the work that we had, and with 3 ethics committees covering 250,000 people. So at that time, we declined to go for certification, which the NHMRC. HOMER grew, became successful, and became the National Mutual Acceptance Scheme. And I still hadn't seen at this point why it should be part of our role. However, at that time, we had an ethics committee in Darwin that was very top-end centric, one in Alice Springs that was very Alice Springs centric, and one at Charles Darwin University for student projects. Even applying for a project in the 2 large hospitals needed 2 entirely separate application processes. 50 paper copies, 2 different sets of deliberation that didn't communicate and that occurred at different times, sometimes releasing conflicting or difficult or additional or even contradictory requirements. True, there were times when the circumstances needed additional requirements to be placed, but that didn't always feel like it was very joined up for researchers. I was starting to see the point in all this, especially because we were often ruling on things that were not ethics, but governance. There was at that time no research governance process, so our decisions often covered governance matters for the then top-end health service, with the Central Australian HREC doing that for the Central Australia Health Service, the then Central Australia Health Service. That led to misunderstandings, so that NGOs, including ACHOs, would be told by researchers or by managers and other organisations that they had to do something because it had ethics approval, even if it were inconvenient or costly for the ACHO. Sometimes they blamed us for that misunderstanding, and sometimes, even worse, they actually believed it to be the case, and they'd help out at the cost of their own work. That's not something to do with the ethics, but the governance. So carrying tribal affiliations through to the ethics committees would not seem to solve it. So, funny story, through a series of very Northern Territory style passes and accidents, I was appointed to be the NT representative to what's now called the Clinical Trials Project Reference Group. From 2014, this group had the aim of increasing Australian clinical trials across the whole country and all sectors. It includes senior bureaucrats and health system leaders, so I am completely out of place there. The intention initially was to get pharma companies to invest in Australia. Across the NT, as in most of the world, clinical trials are just questions about the best way to treat conditions. For various sad reasons, our environment here in the Northern Territory and the institutional structure on that environment means that we might not get the same results of those interventions as elsewhere. The sort of trial that we're interested in can be called public good or open sector. It's asking the question, what is the effect of deciding to do this? Since the CTPRG, that's the Group on Clinical Trials, was started, the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, ACTA, has been formed as an advocacy and best practice organisation. And it estimates that the return on investment for that sort of public good open sector trial is about 600%. But it doesn't come back directly to where it was spent. It's not something that you can use on a balance sheet. It comes back in better health and more efficiency. When the NHMRC funds a trial, that ratio is not 600%, it's 5,100%. Trials are not really important to us in the NT for revenue generation. We don't run a trial for money. They're about how to help the population. So I think it was useful having somebody with the NT focus on the clinical trials group and going through the process of reform for clinical trials where it can be very difficult and where there are often perceived pressures in various directions, I think has been useful for all research. At that time, we would get applications that were problematic for all sorts of subtle reasons. Some wanted to examine the difference between some Indigenous people and some non-Indigenous people, as if that was a single biological determinant that explained the outcomes gap between Indigenous people generally and non-Indigenous people generally, rather than that being due to lack of services, access, trust, or care because of the environment and the institutions upon that environment. We got applications that wanted to divide prescription of drugs by race and to justify that by a causally confounded estimate of the effect of race on side effects. We got applications that wanted to take DNA from Indigenous people without consenting them for ancestry analysis when that was one of the stated aims of the protocol. We got, and you'll all recognise this, 20-page consents written in semi-English language legalese and refusal to simplify them. We got, and I hope you'll feel the reflected embarrassment from the chutzpah like I used to do. We got researchers saying that they would not change their plan just because we said it would cause harm, because we were not a certified ethics committee attached to Sandstone University in a big city, which is not to say anything against certified ethics committees attached to Sandstone universities in big cities. Northern Territory stakeholders from government, NGOs, education and justice were concerned about the low penetrance of information on the NT situation into the national discourse, and about how low awareness of community engagement was caused by and worsened institutional disadvantage. We obviously needed a seat at the table, a way to insist on that information being considered. We needed a designation as authoritative somehow, something to put on a website, present at conferences. So we needed certification. NMA was inevitable. Predictability under the NMA was a watchword, and efficiency was beginning to be measured and quality managed. And that meant that we might, at some point, entirely unpredictable without divination, we might end up having to accept the review of committees that didn't realise that we've had the Race Relations Act suspended in many communities, that Don Dale was policy, that 40% of people in the NT speak a language at home that has nothing to do with English, that home is not one house, that accessing medical care would challenge Shackleton, that research in a population without the engagement of that population can be stigmatizing and can endanger that population without meaning to do so. More than that, we wanted to make the point that it's not just in the Northern Territory that the unkindnesses that have been visited on sections of the population can change the ethical view of what's needed. I know, we all know, that Australian ethics committees are amazing and given the right information will safeguard participants and make research better, to a standard that's not done better anywhere in the world. We know that ethics approval doesn't stop you being master in your own house or in your own organization, that you don't have to take part, but our stakeholders also had to know it as well. But the results of further review would be further delay and bad blood. I'm obviously telling this story for information about internal processes and a bit of a window in the NT. And that window might actually be usable as a mirror from the view from your own house. But I do always remember that as it's the environment that separates us from the rest of Australia, it's the legal, historical and intercultural environment of Australia that creates the troubled NT environment for the populations that we serve here. Part of the preparation involved getting our own backyard in order. Ethics was mildly troubling, although with good reason, and overall quite good performance. The ethics committees worked well together and supported each other with regular contact and regular transfers of information, regular conversations about troublesome projects. The NT Ethics Committee went on to assess complex clinical trials, genomics, and international or data linkage projects. But the real challenge was in site governance. A Commonwealth government scheme called Encouraging More Clinical Trials gave us the prompt, and the scrutiny through reporting back to the Commonwealth to form a research governance office, initially for clinical trials across the territory, but it's spread out to more complex other research as well. Anyone who's ever been involved in regulatory compliance or integrity reviews or reporting and monitoring or institutional change making or continuous quality improvement knows that they basically all come back to one thing, which is turning over a whole load of rocks and trying to keep a straight face at what runs out. Governance includes the assessment of whether a project can be done at a site, the costs in time and material, and the possible benefits, and then prioritizing between all of them. There's a fair amount of work involved in that. It's much more painful to do it without an existing process, particularly for the researchers when requirements are changing. This is where the story gets a little bit more lighthearted. For the Northern Territory to join NMA, and we'd be the last state or territory to join, we'd also have to have a certified ethics committee, or we would have to just accept external review. Don't think for a minute that didn't have a lot to recommend it, but as we noted before, the environment here is a bit rough on people, particularly people on whom the environment has been rough previously. And we don't want to just walk away from the effects of that. But the certification scheme had closed a couple of years earlier, and requesting access to it was a little like approaching a monastery and asking for a ritual. There was a strong sense of these ancient tomes being pulled out of shelves and anchorites being summoned away from the far isle where they were in their hermitage to recall the last of the previous order. We submitted hundreds of pages of material against these ancient criteria. That exacting dossier was made possible by the genuinely amazing ethics administrators, particularly Julianne, whom you didn't see earlier, and Michelle, whom you did. The road ahead of us seemed long and the way was narrow, and we wouldn't know until we'd spent most of our energy whether the journey was possible. There were a very reasonable set of questions that were asked of us. So why do you want to be certified against a closed scheme? The certification scheme was carefully designed to assess whether the supporting institution could keep an ethics committee afloat and supplied with quality opinions, training, stationery, and afternoon tea. It was retired because the NHMRC found it time-consuming and had very few new applications. Imagine lines of monks carrying tons of paper back to the sanctum and completing the lengthy midnight rituals. If those monks are all missing kung fu practice or meditation assembly, then it's hard to staff the process. While considering all this, the NHMRC and others noted that the scheme didn't look at the quality of review, so the successor scheme would be expected to do that. An accreditation scheme might look at how well equipped we are to review certain types of project, and how well we articulate our concerns, and how well we deal with our stakeholders as in the Northern Territory, as the very good point was made by Dr. Finlay earlier. So the other question was, if you want a Boy Scout badge, why don't you wait for the new scheme, which will give you much better accreditation? And where does it leave you if you fail and you can't claim that authenticity? Where does that leave the territory? Well, we weren't too fussed about the type of certification. The NMA scheme rests on a memorandum of understanding between the states and territories that are a part of it. That MOU refers to certified ethics committees, so really there wasn't a choice. So we had to be a certified ethics committee. Now, as usual, when you're asked to examine yourself, the process was useful. While I was preparing to present to you about our journey, I dug out and remembered all the little tiny victories, little milestones, and not so miniature capitulations that marked the way. We formalized the processes that had grown into culture, some of those expanding out a little beyond the existing laws of the territory and affirming norms. Some of them taking non-ethics committee activities and formalizing them as something that the ethics committee would do with knowledge of the Department of Health and the administering institution. We either put them into revised terms of reference and standard operating procedures, or we looked at them carefully and ditched them. We looked over our membership and our training and external relationships and strengthened them all. We went over the separation of labour between the governance and the ethics committees. And again, we forged strong links between the new governance office and the existing ethics committee. And we got researchers, patient groups, government and academics to walk through the proposed processes with us. Not everyone agreed with all the steps. As my computing and IT friends say, every update ruins someone's workflow. They also say, if there's a tension between standardization and customization, then customization had better pay up. The big advantage of NMA is in standardization of procedures so that we can monitor, respond to, and improve outcomes. The big worry was that in joining NMA, we'd no longer be able to see and respond to risks that only arise or are more important in the NT context. We'd no longer be able to see and respond to risks that are present but maybe haven't been noticed from elsewhere, because ethics committees might think this is not a project that engages vulnerability in the participants. The big opportunity was to be able to tell Australia about the NT context, to raise awareness and to make it everyone's job to ensure participant engagement has been sufficient. After all, we're not the only place that these unkindnesses apply, nor are we the place that visits these unkindnesses on the most people. We have a fairly small population. A lot of our population are in historically disadvantaged locations or positions, but that applies to much greater numbers of people across the rest of Australia. So these lessons are for all of Australia. So in a concerted push, we signed the NMA MOU, we got the NT HREC certified and joined the NMA as the last region of Australia to do so. Almost the last region. The Commonwealth is still not a signatory. We have some conditions. We have legal advice on contracts and how signatures can be recorded, and we have the same set of notes about our privacy and information laws as other jurisdictions, and the same constantly moving environment around participants who are unable to consent or waiver of consent for use of healthcare information. These are things that other ethics committees are well able to assess given the information about our laws. We also have an extra step for reassurance of the NT stakeholders. The initial application and any substantial amendment for NMA approved projects are checked by a small committee of the chair, deputy administrators for whether they have a high probability of posing risks that could not have had proper review by an ethics committee unfamiliar with the environment of the NT. If that is the case, then the Northern Territory Ethics Committee will provide further review and communicate with the lead ethics committee. If not, then the project is handed back to the lead ethics committee for future ethical monitoring and reporting. That process has already started, and it's gone quite smoothly with the gracious help of the primary ethics committees and the patience of researchers. We hope that this reservation of further review for high-risk projects will allow us to gain from the NMA without exposing people to additional risk. We also hope that this is an opportunity for us to do things like this, to raise awareness about participant engagement. We've had some researchers who've had their projects ripped up and reset after proper participant engagement. These are great researchers, and they end up with great projects. Not only do the projects run better, the researchers feel they've learned something they can keep and use against the next time, teach to others, and blend into culture. This is what cosmopolitanism looks like. Someday, all ethics committees will ensure that all members are assessed for cultural competence and will recognise that they have a positive duty to increase cultural security by their decisions and actions. And to meet these NHMRC criteria of worthiness for research, community engagement, benefit, sustainability and transferability, and building capability. And really, that's all properly designed research in Australia. And that little modern haiku there, curiosity, open, honest engagement is reliable. It's not of the quality of Basho's, but says what I want it to. In summary, and to finish, we harmonised ethics approvals across the NT. We separated ethics and governance. We ensured all authorising authorities were aware of the functions performed by the Ethics Committee. We wrote the terms of reference and standard operating procedures for all to see. We obtained certification as the only choice out of a number of possible adventures. And we were then able to function as the NMA Ethics Committee for the NT without reducing local input into critical decisions on vulnerable populations. We look forward to working with you all to ensure that all ethics committees, especially in those problematic cross-border applications, are equally able to ensure community engagement, benefit, sustainability and transferability, and to build capacity, and to refer on for further opinions where they've not been demonstrated to be sought so far. And we look forward to learning from the solutions that you all apply. I'll finish there.